Let's explain a bit the context of both armies or ways of fighting and what they consisted of. Macedonian Phalanxes that, led by Alexander the Great, defeated the Persians repeatedly and allowed the king of Macedonia to take the throne of the Persian Empire. Upon his death, his kingdom and dream were divided. These phalanxes, perfected by Philip, Alexander's father, fought in formations with long pikes known as sarissas, which could measure up to 6 meters in length. The phalanxes fought 16 rows deep and would try to cover as much width as possible on the battlefield to prevent the enemy from surrounding them. As obviously having such depth, the necessary amount of men to occupy the entire front would be absolutely large, the Macedonian armies relied on light or medium infantry, which covered their flanks while the cavalry covered their wings.
Let's do a quick calculation.
The distance between the soldiers and the phalanx is not clear, but let's put half a meter of space between each soldier's shoulders. If we have a front of just 100 meters, we need 3,200 men, and 100 meters is nothing for a front. From there, calculate how many troops you would need to have an unbreachable solid line. And why did they need to cover the entire front? Because the phalanx acts similarly to a wall with stakes. From the front, they are practically impenetrable, but if they are surrounded, they become totally useless. In addition, their ability to maneuver is very limited. You have to think that their efficiency lies in their density. So if the soldiers separate from each other to dodge trees or rocks, their advantage breaks, creating gaps in the front. Of those 16 rows, only the first 4, 5, or 6 fought at the same time. The following ones placed their pikes at a certain angle, leaning them on the man in front or vertically depending on their distance to the front line. This forest of pikes above their heads helped so that a percentage of enemy projectiles hit the shafts and did not reach the infantry. On the other hand, we have the Roman legions, which initially fought in the style of the Greek hoplites, also in tight shield wall and spear formations. The hastati, for example, owe their name to the weapon they used in their beginnings, the hasta, which is a spear. However, after a series of defeats against their neighbors in Italy, the Romans discarded this form of fighting and adopted the maniples, which were completely different from the phalanxes. They made changes in their units, resulting in the velites, hastati, principes, and triarii. You can get to know all of them in the playlist that I leave for you up here, where you will see their equipment and their functions. The fact is that they abandoned the spears and adopted the swords. Regarding formations, what they did was reduce the size of these, with maniples and centuries appearing. I'm not going to talk about them because there is a video on the channel that explains the organization of the legions in detail, and that's not the purpose of today's video. The key is that centuries of 80 legionnaires were created, but the truly important thing is that they could act independently. Independent in quotes, because obviously there is a whole hierarchy of command. But the minor decisions in battle fell on the centurion. These units fought in tight formations, which is why we might think it's the same as phalanxes, but the difference is that now only the first line fights, which leads us to the fact that the legionnaires could fend for themselves against the enemy, even in a duel. Another modification that the legions underwent was the incorporation of pila, which are a kind of heavy javelins that could pierce shields and render them useless. Each hastati and prince carried 2 pila, which were thrown at the enemy before the clash. Okay, now that I've briefly described each unit, let's see how the Romans dealt with the fearsome phalanxes. Maneuverability. We'll see that all is based on maneuverability and cohesion. Let's suppose we have this map. As we can see, there are various rocks or obstacles to avoid. On one hand, we have the legions, which behave like a fluid around a stone, simply surrounding it, breaking the formation. And what happens if the legions are attacked just as they break formation? Well, the legionnaires would suffer from not having a solid front, but since the Roman armies have atomized, reducing formations to centuries of 80 men, the defense is much more effective. And each century could fend for itself, forming as its centurion deems necessary, following the general guidelines of the legion's legate or consul. In addition, the legionnaires can turn in one direction or another at any moment, changing the orientation of the century in just a few seconds. After repelling the attack, or if it has not occurred and overcoming the obstacle, the legions reform and are ready. Let's see what happens with the phalanxes. As I mentioned, the phalanx bases its advantage on cohesion. Therefore, if the phalanxes have to dodge an obstacle but be prepared to face the enemy, they will have to make a huge detour to maintain the front. In this way, they take much longer, get more tired, but a frontal attack would be repeated. If they don't do it and are attacked, they will be easily surrounded by the enemy and crushed, as they are unable to have a front that occupies the width of the battlefield. They lose their effectiveness as the enemy does not see the need to charge the pikes head on. On the other hand, the speed at which a phalanx can rotate to face a threat is much lower than that of a century. And how do we apply this to the battle? Well, the clearest example we have is in the Battle of Perna. In this battle, the Macedonians formed in their typical phalanx, and in turn the Romans formed a standard front. Both formations launched into the attack, but the Romans were unable to break through the ranks. Some legionnaires, improvising, managed to deflect the spears upwards with their tilted shields and charge against the phalangites, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with their swords. This happened, but since very few legionnaires managed to do it, it did not succeed. Now, as a personal opinion, if the legionnaires had trained this move to deflect the spears and charge to engage in hand-to-hand combat, I am sure the Romans would have achieved victory at that moment. But it didn't happen that way, so the first Roman line was defeated and retreated. The Macedonians began to advance, approaching the second Roman line, which also charged against the Macedonians and was likewise defeated. The proconsul seems to have organized the retreat to a point just behind an irregular terrain. The phalanxes continued to advance, but of course, as I mentioned, they entered irregular terrain, making it impossible for the Macedonians to maintain the cohesion of the front. At that moment, the Romans charged, and being guided by the centurions, the sentries slipped through the gaps in the front. And this doomed the phalanxes. The phalangites, with their pikes lowered, were unable to fight at very close range, so they were swept away by the legionaries and their gladiuses. This shows that a breach in the front results in the defeat of the pikemen. An example now of the slowness or inability of the phalanxes to face enemies coming from other directions is seen in the Battle of Cynocephaly. Let's remember that the flanks of the phalanxes were covered by troops or lighter or cavalry, which tried to prevent the enemy from surrounding them. In that case, the Romans managed to finish off the enemy flank and attack the phalanxes from the back. The phalanxes took too long to react, that is, to turn around to face the new threat, and were destroyed. The problem they had was that their units were too large, so they could not be subdivided to fight on two fronts, ignoring the slowness of a phalanx to pivot. On the other hand, we have the Roman legions. These, having so many well-defined divisions, cohorts, maniples, centuries, and even contubernia, can be subdivided as much as necessary to adapt to new situations. Now let's break a lance in favor of the Enthenocephalous Greeks. It's true that when an army is attacked from the rear, a lot of discipline is needed to prevent their morale from falling and fleeing in disarray. Let's go now to the start of the battle, the clash between both armies. Remember that the Manipular legions had the Velites in the vanguard, who rained down a shower of javelins on the enemy. This projectile attack disrupted the enemy formation, which could allow the legionnaires to charge through the created gaps. But in addition, the legionnaires carried the pila, which also wreaked havoc among the enemies. We are going to do a kind of summary now, commenting on various aspects and declaring one or another formation the winner. I know that my assessment is not going to be to everyone's liking and that many of you may even take it badly, but this is still subjective. If someone disagrees, they should mention it respectfully in the comments, and that's it. Maneuverability, an indisputable point for the Romans, thanks mainly to their way of fighting and the atomization of their formations. Adaptation. In this point, I'm referring to the formation's ability to adapt to the development of the battle, such as dealing with a flank. I'm not going to count the light troops that protected the Phalanxes, just as I don't count the auxiliaries of the Roman legions. In this case, point again for the Romans. Versatility. In this aspect, I am referring to the ability of the warriors in those formations to use various types of weapons. The legionnaires carried the gladius and the pila, which they always used, while the pikemen used the sarissa. It's true that they carried a sword, but if they ever unsheathed it, defeat was probably near, so I give the point to the Romans. Attack capability. Here I am going to value only frontal combat, as I have previously valued flanks. The undisputed winner is the Phalanx, as that hedgehog of pikes was practically impossible to penetrate. Movement speed. I don't think there's much explanation needed here. I value the speed of each type of formation, which is useful for taking positions, sending reserves, covering gaps, or even escaping. Here at first it might seem obvious to give the point to the Romans, but of course when the Phalanxes move from the rear, which is what I'm valuing, they don't carry their pikes down, so they're not that slow. Even though they still move slower than the legionaries with their pikes up, I lean towards calling it a tie. Transition speed. In this regard, I value the speed at which the unit can switch from, for example, a column formation to the phalanx or the Roman one, ready to withstand a charge or attack. This point goes to the legions. Let me explain. The legionnaires fight independently in their shield wall, so as long as the first line is formed, the century can already fight. The following lines can arrive and form behind without any problem, and the transition from column to front is also simple. On the other hand, the fringes, being such the number of soldiers, requires more time to form, and something very important, even if the first line is in position, it is necessary that those behind are also. Why? The phalanx strength comes from the high density of pikes, so a single line formed, they will barely be able to face the enemy. On the other hand, the arissas protrude behind the pikeman as a counterweight, which makes it difficult for the rear lines to get into position if the front ones are already in attack position. Finally, reaction to ambushes. I didn't know whether to add this aspect or not, as it's not part of a battle as such. After all, a plane for example is lethal on the battlefield, but if unexpectedly attacked while on the ground, it's useless. I'm going to value the ambush and let everyone decide whether to ignore this point or not. And again, the point goes to the Romans. The legionnaires carried the shield and sword with them, as well as food, water, and stakes on their shoulder. If they were attacked, they would throw their supplies to the ground and were ready to fight. It's true that their shields were still in their sheaths, but that didn't stop them from being effective. The Macedonian pikemen, for their part, carried their sarissas divided in two, and in battle they joined both pieces and were ready to fight. Of course, in an ambush they didn't have time to assemble the sarissa, and even if they did, they would need time they don't have to form the phalanx. We have a clear winner, the Roman legion, but let me note that phalanxes usually fought against other phalanxes, so they did not need to update to face other forms of combat. It's true that they fought against Persians and enemies to the north of Greece, but that didn't force them to evolve. When they faced the Romans, it was already too late to change. They managed to defeat them on several occasions, but since the Romans evolved remorselessly, they adapted and ultimately came out victorious. Mind you, the Romans also suffered defeats when facing other forms of combat, like against the Parthians and their mounted archers or the Goths at Adrianople. Here ends today's video. Many thanks to everyone, and especially to the patrons and senators of the Hispanic Guard for supporting the channel and keeping this project going. Hit like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes.